Meanwhile, the House is expected to vote tomorrow on foreign aid bills that include money for Israel, Ukraine, and a crackdown on TikTok. The revised TikTok legislation would give ByteDance a year to find new ownership instead of 6 months. If the House passes the bill, the Senate could vote on it as soon as next week. Politico is reporting that the Chinese embassy has been holding meetings with congressional staff to lobby against the legislation that would force a sale of TikTok. Joining me now is the Hudson Institute Senior Fellow, Atlas Organization founder, and the author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward, back with me this morning. Jonathan, good to see you. Your reaction to this vote on TikTok?
Hi, Maria. Well, look, I think we just have to get this done. I mean, this is probably the biggest test of American seriousness on the China issue that we're facing thus far. I mean, it's really a battle in the longer-term contest against China in the new Cold War and everything we're going through. This is actually a primary battle, whether or not we can get this app that's owned by an adversary state out of the hands of that adversary state when you have half of America on that app. And just to see that this new scoop from Politico, where apparently the Chinese embassy is out there lobbying the Hill, and the talking points are pretty rich. I mean, one of them is that it would harm American investors who helped to build ByteDance and TikTok, so General Atlantic, Sequoia Capital, and of course Susquehanna International Group. I mean, the idea, Maria, that this was ever a good investment. I mean, to go and build a technology company in the People's Republic of China, to nurture it, to watch it participate in the human rights abuses that go on in that country, and then to be concerned about losing your capital. I think we've got to get serious about this, and I think it's okay and it's appropriate for some of these bad investments in an enemy state to go down very significantly. And I think that's just part of making mistakes with American capital.
Well, in talking about investors, let's talk about the subject that I have raised umpteen times on this program, and that is how individual investors are inadvertently funding the expansion of our #1 adversary, and that is China, with so many Chinese stocks trading on our U.S. exchanges. Now, a House Select Committee on China investigation finds that American financial institutions facilitated the investment of more than $6.5 billion to 63 Chinese companies that are actually blacklisted by the United States last year. The committee also finding that index provider MSCI facilitated $3.7 billion into those companies alone. BlackRock invested nearly $2 billion into those companies. The story is important. This is a congressional investigation, and it's finding that Wall Street is using billions of dollars of American retirement money and other investments to buy these index funds that are invested in Chinese companies. Your thoughts on this investigation, how it plays out, and do investors understand what they're buying into when they buy these Chinese stocks in this MSCI index?
Well, sure. And a few thoughts here, Maria. I mean, one, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, what the congressional committee did was basically cross-reference the BlackRock and MSCI indexes with companies that are actually on U.S. blacklists from Treasury, from DOD, from Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. So I did the same thing in The Decisive Decade and pointed out some of the companies that are on the MSCI indexes. And what I did was look at actual cross-references from testimonies from the Chinese concentration camps, where some of those who've been in those camps, were aware of the technology that was being used. So, Zhejiang Dahua Technology, for example, iFlyTech, these sorts of things that, yes, they're on the MSCI indexes. I mean, it's just incredible what we've been doing. On one hand, these large, companies like BlackRock are simply involved in any investable asset on planet Earth. But on the other hand, the fact that we haven't had policy action to line up, our identification of Chinese human rights atrocities and, military-related companies with actual investment by the U.S. and by our allies. I mean, it's time to get that done, so I think this has to turn into policy action. But I think the good news is that the Congress, and I'd emphasize this, I mean, they're starting to see the battle space here. And as you know, for your audience for almost 5 years, we've been talking about the fact that the real battle space is Chinese corporations. I mean, that's how the Communist Party of China executes its global strategy. It's how they execute their military strategies. It's how they do the Belt and Road. It's how they do Made in China 2025. I mean, there's this whole deep, rich space of Chinese companies. And I think that's what we ultimately have to be targeting. We have to pull out investment. We have to pull out technology, and we can go after these things and really degrade and destroy the companies that are the worst parts of the Chinese state. And I think we've got to do that. And I think we have a lot of tools with which to do that. The list here on MSCI BlackRock is just a start. I mean, he's only talking about $6 billion here, when in fact we're funneling hundreds of billions of dollars every year into the People's Republic of China. If you go to look at the broader index here, so the actual MSCI emerging markets or MSCI China A shares, those sorts of things, most of which is still aligned with the Chinese state, and a whole lot of which has to do with the SASAC corporation. So you're talking about 97 Chinese state-owned enterprises that span every key strategic industry. They're $4 trillion in revenue a year and over $30 trillion in assets. So there's quite a large cluster here of targetable entities, I think. And then the Congress also just released an act called the No Limits Act, which is about sanctioning Chinese companies that are helping to rebuild Russia's defense industrial base. I also talked about that in Decisive Decade to help make the point of the target list that we could use. So here you start to get onto some even more interesting companies, because you're talking about things like China National Offshore, energy companies. I mean, the major sort of petroleum companies, the rail companies, some of the big SOEs are on this second list in the No Limits Act.
Yeah.
And, these are real economic strike packages, which is what I've, talked about over the years. I mean, you've got to put something together that includes OFAC, that includes entities list, export controls, all of this, and then you start taking these things out. We have many good reasons, and we need to start executing.
And that is why Roger Robinson speaks about this so often on this program. He set policy on this during the Reagan administration and has been very vocal about the fact that investors should not be funding the expansion of our #1 adversary, who is funding things like Iran and Russia. Now, this committee has no legislative power, but it is urging the U.S. lawmakers in this report to restrict capital flows as U.S.-China competition intensifies. Why are leaders in this country so afraid to pull that capital markets lever? We've got the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world. China, of course, wants to be in those markets so that it can attract investor dollars, and we're allowing it, even as China continues to show that it wants to roll over America, from surveillance to fentanyl to COVID and beyond.
Well, sure, and if you take this within the context of fentanyl, I mean, I think that was the most one of the most important hearings that the China Commission did, since its inception, was the hearing on fentanyl just last week on the Hill, and they pointed out that it's the leading cause of the drop in life expectancy in America and the leading cause of death from Americans age 18 to 45. And meanwhile, the Communist Party of China is directly subsidizing the manufacturing and export of illicit fentanyl materials, including giving grants to the companies that are trafficking this. I mean, this is probably one of the most hostile acts that's ever been undertaken against the United States in our modern history. So the context of going after their companies and being somewhat ruthless about doing what needs to be done, I think, the context is there. And, the committee can lead the way in terms of educating and also, as they're doing, proposing some actionable work here that can be done. And I think they should be, sort of broad-minded, think big. And also, I think we need to look at the Chinese banking sector. I mean, that's where the real vulnerabilities are. I mean, there are some of those banks. The Chinese ambassador, right after Putin's invasion, said our companies need to step in as the West steps out, and that included some of their major banks. So I think it's time for us to look at that, too.
But, by the way, investors should be looking at their holdings right now and get out of these companies. We're talking about MSCI and BlackRock. Don't forget Vanguard. Vanguard's the same, if not worse, with all of the companies that it is invested in China. So we are having a spotlight on it, and we'll continue that. Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan D.T. Ward joining us on China.